On the night of June 24th, the ground under northern Venezuela moved twice. Two ruptures, magnitude 7.2 and magnitude 7.5, arriving within about half a minute of each other. In the coastal state of La Guaira, entire blocks came down. Official figures now put the dead above 5,500, with more than 16,000 injured and tens of thousands of people still without homes. Those numbers are still being revised, and some independent tallies run higher. Here is the part that should stop you cold. The fault that did that is the same kind of fault that runs underneath Southern California, not similar in a loose, headline sort of way, the same mechanical family, two plates grinding sideways past each other at almost the same speed. And 6 weeks after Caracas, a seismologist who has spent her career telling Californians the truth about their ground went on television in Los Angeles and said that what happened there is what she expects to happen here. I want to walk you through what a new study found about the stress sitting under Los Angeles right now, why one narrow mountain pass northeast of the city has become the single most important piece of geography in California, and what the scientists behind this research are careful to say they cannot tell you. If you want the honest version of stories like this one, without the doomsday theater, subscribing takes a second, and it is how these end up in front of you. Let me start with the finding, because it is blunt. A team led by Liliane Burkhard, a geophysicist at the University of Bern, who is also a research affiliate at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, published a study in the Journal of Geophysical Research, Solid Earth. Co-authors came from Northern Arizona University, the United States Geological Survey, and the University of California, San Diego. They built a physics-based model of the southern San Andreas and the San Jacinto fault systems, fed it 1,000 years of reconstructed earthquake history, and ran it forward to today. The result: stress on multiple fault segments is now at or above the highest levels seen anywhere in that entire 1,000-year reconstruction. One segment stands out. The San Bernardino stretch of the San Jacinto Fault carries a modeled stress load of 3.6 megapascals. That is the highest single value anywhere in the millennium the team simulated, and it exceeds that segment's own previous peak from close to 50 years ago. 3.6 megapascals is a laboratory number, so let me make it something you can feel. It is roughly 35 times the pressure the entire atmosphere puts on your shoulders at sea level. Take everything the sky weighs, stack it 35 times over, and press it sideways into rock that is already trying not to slip. The Mojave South segment of the San Andreas came in at 2.8 megapascals, which also beat its own record from about a decade ago. Two fault systems, both loaded past anything the model has seen since roughly the time the Normans invaded England, and they nearly touch. That is where the geography stops being trivia and starts being the whole story. Northeast of Los Angeles, maybe 60 miles from downtown, the San Gabriel Mountains and the San Bernardino Mountains fail to meet. Between them there is a gap. Californians call it Cajon Pass. If you have driven from Los Angeles toward Las Vegas, you have gone through it, probably without thinking about it, probably while looking for a gas station. Cajon Pass exists because two fault systems have been chewing the rock there for millions of years. The San Andreas comes up from the southeast. The San Jacinto runs alongside it. At the pass, they come close enough that a rupture tearing along one of them arrives at the doorstep of the other. And because it is the only easy gap through the mountains, almost everything Southern California needs to survive has been threaded through it. Interstate 15. The main freight rail lines that connect the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach to the rest of the country. Power transmission, fuel pipelines, fiber, water. Water is the one that should make you sit up. In Burkhard's words to ABC7, aqueducts cross the San Andreas Fault, and if something happens, you might not have water for a while. Southern California does not drink local water. It imports it across hundreds of miles through channels that cross the very fault the region is worried about. So picture a rail yard, because that is the cleanest way to understand what the study is describing. A freight line comes barreling down the track at enormous speed. Ahead, there is a switch If the switch is set one way, the train stays on its line and eventually runs out of track. If the switch is thrown the other way, the train crosses onto a second line and keeps going into territory it was never supposed to reach. Cajon Pass is that switch. A rupture is the train, and the study's central discovery is about what throws the switch. Burkhard's team calls it an earthquake gate. Sometimes it blocks a large rupture from crossing between the two faults. Sometimes it lets that rupture pass straight through and involve both systems in a single event. It is not a wall and it is not an open road. It has behaved both ways in the past, and the study set out to figure out which conditions produced which outcome. Here is what they found, and this is the sentence the whole video turns on. Earthquakes crossed the junction when the stress on both sides of the pass was high and, more importantly, closely matched. Not just loaded, aligned. When one side was heavily stressed and the other was relaxed, the rupture tended to stop. When both sides were sitting near the same elevated level, the rupture kept going. And in Burkhard's own phrasing, that is the configuration the region is approaching today. Think about what that means mechanically. A rupture crossing a fault junction is a bit like a crack running through a windshield. It races along until it meets a boundary, and whether it jumps that boundary depends on whether the material on the far side is already close to failing. If the far side is slack, the crack dies at the seam. If the far side is straining just as hard, the crack does not even slow down. The stress on the two faults has to be in something like agreement for the switch to throw. Now, how do you reconstruct 1,000 years of that? Nobody had instruments in the year 1026. This is the part of the research I find quietly remarkable. The team assembled the earthquake history from the ground itself, radiocarbon dating of sediment layers that were offset by past ruptures, tree ring records, because a tree standing near a fault that suddenly lurches will record the trauma in its growth, historical accounts of groundbreaking open from the Spanish mission period onward. Out of that, you get a timeline of when this fault system let go and roughly how far each rupture ran. Across the last 1,000 years, the San Andreas and San Jacinto together produced 36 earthquakes of magnitude 6.4 or larger. That works out to 1 every 28 years on average, which tells you something important right away. This is not a quiet system. It is a system that has recently gone unusually quiet. Feed all of that into a 4-dimensional model that tracks stress in 3 dimensions of rock plus time, and you can watch the load build during silent centuries, drop when a segment ruptures, redistribute onto neighboring segments, and slowly creep back as the deep crust relaxes after a big event. Run it to the present day, and the model tells you where the ledger stands. 2 entries in that ledger matter more than the rest. 1812, the Wrightwood earthquake, magnitude 7.5. Researchers suspect that rupture went through Cajon Pass and rippled along both the San Andreas and the San Jacinto systems. 40 people died in a California that was a scattering of missions and small settlements. The gate was open, and almost nobody was standing there. 1857, Fort Tejon, magnitude 7.9. A stretch of the San Andreas roughly 205 miles long slipped sideways, running from Parkfield in the north down to Cajon Pass. That is the length of the drive from Los Angeles to San Francisco, most of the way, tearing open in a matter of minutes. And then, nothing. On that southern stretch, nothing of that scale since. More than 160 years, when that fault last released a great earthquake, the American Civil War had not started yet. Meanwhile, the plates never stopped moving. The Pacific side of the San Andreas slides past the North American side at about 30 millimeters a year, which is a little more than an inch, close to the width of your thumb. Sounds like nothing, but it never pauses, not for a single day, and it has been doing it for 169 years. That is something like 16 feet of motion the fault owes and has not paid. Quick question while we are here and I read these. Have you ever actually felt an earthquake? Not seen one on the news, felt one. Tell me where you were and what it sounded like, because the sound is the part nobody warns you about. Now I have to slow down, because this is exactly the point where a channel with less respect for you would start writing a date on the calendar. I am not going to do that, and neither did the scientists. Burkhard says it plainly. This is not a prediction of when an earthquake will happen. What she says the work can tell you is that the system is critically stressed and that physics-based models like this one give a clearer picture of the range of scenarios worth preparing for. Hold on to the difference, because it is everything. A stress level is not a countdown. Nobody drilled a hole into the San Jacinto fault and read 3.6 megapascals off a gauge. That number is the output of a simulation built on a reconstructed history, and every link in that chain carries uncertainty. Radiocarbon dates come with error bars measured in decades. The paleoseismic record is patchy because it only survives where the geology cooperated. The model has to make assumptions about how the deep crust behaves. That is the strongest objection a careful skeptic can make, and it deserves a straight answer rather than a dismissal. The answer is that the authors are not claiming to have found a fuse burning. They are claiming to have narrowed the range of scenarios that hazard planners have to take seriously, and specifically to have shown that a joint rupture across the pass belongs in that range rather than being treated as an exotic edge case. That is a modest claim scientifically and a significant one practically, because it feeds into how building codes get written, how insurance is priced, and where money goes for retrofitting. Lucy Jones, the Caltech seismologist, who has been the public voice of California earthquake science for decades, put the timing question the way a scientist has to. It could go another 100 years. It could be tomorrow. It could be, in her words, the next minute. That is not a dodge. That is the honest shape of the answer. Faults do not run on schedules, and any channel that tells you otherwise is selling something. While I am correcting things, let me knock down two more. Southern California recorded 15 separate seismic sequences in 2024 that included at least one quake of magnitude 4 or greater, which Jones noted was the highest annual count in 65 years. That is worth knowing. It is not a countdown either. A busy year of moderate shaking is not the fault clearing its throat, and there is no verified way to tell a foreshock from an ordinary quake until after the big one arrives. And no, California is not going to fall into the ocean. The two sides slide past each other horizontally. In 10 million years, Los Angeles may be a suburb of San Francisco, which is a much stranger fate than sinking. So the honest version is this: nothing has been scheduled and the load is real. Which brings us to the question that matters more than timing. If the gate does open, what does that actually look like on the ground? We have a detailed answer for the smaller version of this, and it is sobering enough. The shakeout scenario, built in 2008 by the United States Geological Survey with more than 300 scientists and engineers, modeled a magnitude 7.8 on the southern San Andreas alone, not a joint rupture, one fault. In that scenario, downtown Los Angeles shakes for 55 seconds. Northridge, in 1994, shook the city for around 7. So take the worst thing modern Los Angeles has lived through and stretch it out nearly 8 times longer, which changes everything about how buildings fail, because structures that survive a short jolt come apart when the shaking keeps asking. The ground itself offsets by up to 13 meters in places, and by as much as 8 meters where lifelines cross the fault. 8 meters is about 26 feet. Imagine a highway that ends and then picks up again 2 car lengths sideways. Now do that to a water aqueduct, a gas pipeline, and a fiber trunk line at the same moment. The scenario counts around 1,600 fires igniting at once, in a region where fire engines will be trying to reach them over roads that no longer connect. Fire alone accounts for $87 billion of the loss. In total, the study projected roughly 1,800 deaths, 50,000 injuries serious enough to need emergency care, and about $200 billion in damage and economic losses. Spread across the more than 20 million people who live in Southern California, that is somewhere near $9,000 taken out of every single life in the region. And the shakeout rupture crosses Cajon Pass, The lifelines it severs are the ones threaded through that gap, along with Interstate 10 at San Gorgonio Pass and State Route 14. That is the single fault version. The Burkhard study's joint rupture scenario reaches somewhere around magnitude 7.4 to 7.8, and here the arithmetic of earthquakes gets counterintuitive. A magnitude 7.8 does not release twice what a 7.4 does, it releases about 4 times as much energy. But the more important difference is not the magnitude, it is the footprint. A rupture that involves both fault systems shakes a far larger area at once, hitting greater Los Angeles, San Bernardino, Riverside, and the Coachella Valley in a single event, instead of leaving one of those regions relatively intact to send help to the others. That is the real meaning of the gate. It is not about a bigger number. It is about whether the disaster is regional or whether it is everywhere at once. Jones made a point in that August broadcast that I keep turning over. She said we underestimate the social and the economic disruption, that we are so focused on our fear of dying that we forget to be afraid of being bankrupted. Los Angeles has spent decades on mandatory retrofits and updated codes, and that work is real and it saves lives. The buildings will mostly stand. What will not stand, in the same way, are the systems that make urban life possible. Water, power, fuel, the ability to get to work, the ability to run a business, the ability to stay housed while a landlord's building is red tagged, which is precisely the lesson Venezuela is living through right now. I want to handle that comparison carefully because thousands of people died there and they are not a teaching aid. But the scientists themselves drew the line, so let me report it accurately. Jones said what happened in Venezuela was movement on their plate boundary strike slip fault, and that this is what the San Andreas is. She said the rupture began west of Caracas and then tore toward Caracas, which focused the energy into the most heavily populated ground, and she said she expects that to happen here as well. The physical parallel is close. Sylvain Barbeau, a geophysicist at the University of Southern California, pointed out that the Venezuelan plate boundary moves at about 20 millimeters a year, while the San Andreas moves at about 30. Same mechanism, comparable pace, similar capacity for very large earthquakes. Then Jones drew the distinction that matters, and she did not soften either half of it. Yes, she said, it is very, very similar. Yes, we have better buildings. No, we have not solved the problem, and we are not immune from what happened to them. That is the whole calibration in 4 sentences. Better construction changes the death toll. It does not change the physics, and it does not protect a water system that has to cross the fault to reach you. So what do you do with all of this? If you live anywhere from the Coachella Valley to the San Fernando Valley. The people who study this for a living keep giving the same unglamorous answers, and the unglamorous answers are the ones that work. Retrofit if your house is older and sits on a raised foundation, because a house sliding off its cripple wall is one of the most common and most preventable failures. Store water and store more than you think, because the aqueducts are the vulnerable piece, and refilling them is not a matter of days. Have a plan for how your family finds each other when the phones are useless. Know how to shut off your gas, and know what to do in the first few seconds. Jones put it simply, if you use those seconds to get under a strong table, you can at least be dug back out. Drop, cover, hold on. It is not dramatic advice. It is the advice that has the data behind it. There is one more thing worth saying about the study, and it is the part that will outlast this news cycle. The modeling framework the team built is not California specific. Fault junctions like Cajon Pass exist all over the planet, in Turkey, in New Zealand, in Japan, wherever 2 great fault systems come close enough to hand a rupture to each other. The researchers want to turn this into a reusable tool for multi-fault hazard assessment, which means the question being asked under Los Angeles right now is going to get asked under a lot of other cities. So here is where the story sits tonight. 2 of the most important faults in North America are carrying more stress than the model has seen in 1,000 years. The junction between them has behaved as a gate before, opening in 1812 and holding closed at other times, and the condition that historically opens it is the two sides arriving at matched high stress. The team says the region is approaching that configuration now. Nobody knows when. The scientists who did the work are the ones saying loudest that nobody knows when. The thing to watch is not a seismograph on a live stream. It is whether this modeling gets folded into the next revision of the National Seismic Hazard Model, the document that quietly decides how strong California builds and what it costs to insure a house there. That is where a study like this either changes something or does not, and there is a smaller marker on the calendar too. Every October, millions of Californians drop under their desks for the statewide drill. And this year, that 30 seconds of practice is landing in a very different context than last year's. I will be tracking both. Hit subscribe and turn on the bell if you want the update when the hazard model revision lands, because that is the moment this stops being a paper and starts being policy. The fault has been keeping its ledger for 169 years. It is not in a hurry. It has never needed to be.